go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ASCII Anything presented by Moser Consulting. I'm your host, Angel Leon, Moser's Director of Personnel. We're glad that you're with us for this episode of ASCII Anything because today we're going to be discussing the revised ADA 508 standards for IT accessibility with my guests, Anwar Eaton, Emma Rosen, and Sandy Nguyen. In this episode, we explore the revised ADA/508 standards and what they mean for businesses and federal agencies. We'll break down the key updates made in 2017, which align with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, and discuss how these changes impact electronic and information technology. With that, let's welcome our guests, Anwar Eaton, Emma Rosen, and Sandy Nguyen. Guys, how are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right, so this is 3 against 1, so I'm going to take it easy here.
Are you saying Brian doesn't help you?
I think, he does, but he's in the background, he's doing his thing. I'd rather not bother him with,
I also sometimes don't help him, depending on my mood.
So I'm going to let you guys do most of the talking. I'm just going to be here to steer the conversation. But honestly, I think this is a really good topic to discuss, especially nowadays. So let's start off with what are the major updates in the revised ADA/508 standards, and how do they affect federal agencies and businesses?
A lot of what's changed recently is not so much you have to do this, this, and this. A lot of what you see now with the ADA ruling is basically it's a wider breadth of people that it's touching. So instead of it only being federal government, now it's touching state and local agencies. The exact numbers I could pull up, but then I'll just be reading off the screen, so I'm not going to. Basically, you'll see in 2026, it's going to hit state and local agencies. And what that does for us and everyone is basically saying, if you're going into your smaller towns and trying to access your public library or any kind of social services, you should be able to access those without any kind of barriers or errors. But it also goes a little bit broader because people like us who might be building software for a company or a federal agency or state agency and just handing it off and they're pulling it in, it's still beholden by the same rules instead of it being oh, we're doing a third-party application and we're integrating that in. So it's you look at our tools our time tracker or any of the other ones, and it's if we sold that to a state agency, we'd still have to make sure that that's compliant. So it definitely broadens the scope of it, where more people are now impacted by it if you're trying to sell to those state and local agencies. But then also, if you're trying to get local grants and you have to build a website for them, you also have to think, okay, are these accessible sites? So a lot of it still, if you know what WCAG 2.1 is, it still kind of goes by that, even though they have changed a lot of those standards, not a lot, some of those standards over the past year, but you're basically following WCAG 2.1 level AA with all of it. So what that means is go on the site, look at it. There's a giant list of rules and you can follow those basically and make sure that you're following those rules. Sandy or Emma, did I miss anything on that?
Not that I'm aware of. You did great.
Thank you.
It's like Family Feud. Good answer. Good answer.
With that being said, how can companies ensure their digital tools and IT systems meet the new accessibility requirements?
Well, on the Section 508 website, they actually have a really good resource on this, and they actually have a roadmap that companies can follow, whether or not this is a new organization that is very new to these standards, or they're more established policies on this. They can use this roadmap to help them out. So there's 6 steps for this, and I can just briefly go through each step. But the first one kind of starts with building awareness and support. So you're talking amongst your employees about what Section 508 is, what is accessibility, and just learning more about that. The second step for an organization is just to practice universal design. And this is where you're starting to just adopt and integrate some of these universal design principles into your work. And then the third step is to update your agency policies. So if you already have existing policies for accessibility, this is where you'd kind of review those policies again and update them based on the new requirements. And if you're a newer company to these standards, what you do is you start building out some of these policies that you can have and refer back to. And then the fourth step is just to procure and develop accessible technology. So this is where when you're purchasing technology or you are building out new technology, you're ensuring that it's accessible from the start. And then the next step after this is just to create accessible documents. So making sure any documentation that you have is accessible. And to help you out with this, what you can do is use tools that already have accessibility features for you. And some of these tools are Microsoft Office or Adobe Acrobat. So if you're using any of those tools, that should help you out in terms of making your document accessible. And then finally, the last step of the roadmap is just to measure and monitor your progress. So just making sure you're measuring your progress and making sure you're hitting your accessibility goals that you may have, and just kind of periodically just measuring your progress and making sure you're hitting your end goal of being accessible.
So as Sandy said, there's a ton of resources, and she was just talking about the roadmap. I also found on section 508.gov a playbook. I don't know what the difference between a roadmap and a playbook, but there is a what's it called? Technology accessibility playbook as well. So those are also kind of step-by-step processes. And as she also alluded to, there's lots of websites that can automatically check things for you. So there's just a ton of resources out there that really walk you through how to come into compliance.
It's always interesting with like accessibility like this because there's one that we always use called Ally, A21Y project. And they do a really good job of like breaking down these standards between the code area where it's like, okay, you have to have somewhat of a development background to understand this, and more of like, okay, it's hard for you to read this. Maybe this is a problem. And being able to translate those into like it's ruling, X, Y, and Z of that and actually translate that into like the law. So it's kind of like you have to find some place that meets you where you're at somewhat with it, where it's not all about like deep backend code using screen readers and all this kind of stuff. Some of it's just like teaching your developers, your POs, your teammates, just like, hey, when you're doing this, watch out for this because we caught this mistake before. And as Sandy said, like it is a lot about education. It's like meeting people where they're at. So it's like having one expert in-house and that person being like the advocate and like talking to people. Like we've done that here before of bringing our team to the School for the Blind and allowing them to like see how they interact with stuff. And so it's kind of like reach out to your community too. It's like it's not just that internal company. It's like, is there people in your community that want to help technology out so that they
Right.
can use it as well? So
Yeah.
all that's kind of interesting how to shape that ball.
Well, and it sounds like it's I don't know if a major overhaul is the right term, but it sounds like it is a major overhaul because you guys are talking about websites and forums, etc., to make sure that they're meeting these standards. So obviously, it's not just changing all that, but then it's about auditing and making sure that everything is running consistently to what the new regulations say, correct?
Yeah. I think like to your point about like the major overhaul is it's like one of the things that we offer like as a company is we do come in and we do audits and like help people out to like look at their site. But when we say that, we don't just say, here's everything that we found, please fix this, and then you can move on. What we try to do is educate them as well to say, okay, we fixed these things, but you guys are probably going to create a new web page in a day, a month, a year, whatever that might be. And here's the best practices to think about as you're going through it. Here's how we caught this. Here's how we did it. We would love for them to come back at some point. But the thing about like auditing a website, looking at a website is it's not just like a one and done thing. It's you want to kind of constantly do it, get another pair of eyes on it, be that internal resource as well. And that just helps it out more and more. Cause it's like, if you guys check it first and then we check it second, like you guys save money. Like we're not going to charge you like an arm and a leg going through your site if we're not finding a lot of errors. But if we're finding more, it takes more time and then it creates more work on your end. But it's like if you guys are just looking for a second pair of eyes, it helps out a lot.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was alluding to, is that it's not just a one and done deal. It's a process because, as you were mentioning, once you guys go through and sort of look at everything that's available, you're going to make your point. You're going to point out what necessarily needs to change right away, what maybe that could be done down the line. So it's not just a one and done deal. It's a process that in order for the organization to meet that standard by next year, by the middle of next year, you still have time to work on it. You still have time to develop those tools. And then after you develop those tools, it's now a process of keeping up and maintaining it, right?
Yeah, and things change and improve. So you just have to keep, it's not going to stop probably.
Right. So let's talk about some of those risks or penalties that businesses face if they fail to comply with Section 508.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different consequences. Maybe top of mind would be legal consequences. Lawsuits can be filed by individuals with disabilities or organizations representing them if they can't access digital content. There are legal fees, of course, and usually passed down by the court would be fines and then court-ordered remediation to bring your content into compliance. So it's not just like a business can pay a price for non-compliance and move on. They will have to spend the time and money and resources to bring all those things into compliance. So you might as well get ahead of that. Something I also found about those fines is that it's not always just a fixed price. I saw that some fines can be per instance of non-compliance. So if you're not thinking about compliance at all, it's very unlikely that one button on your website has text that's too small. It's probably rampant. So that stuff can add up a lot if it's a fine per instance of non-compliance, which I thought was pretty interesting. Aside from legal consequences, there's also like contracts with federal agencies, and obviously the more widespread these standards are is like when they apply to state agencies, to whatever, you're obviously missing out on a lot of business opportunities to secure contracts, since these agencies need to procure technology that meets those standards. So if you don't, then of course you're missing out on that growth and revenue. As alluded to earlier as well, there's audits. So if you're audited and non-compliance is found, businesses are going to have to provide a lot of documentation, test results, remediation plans, and there will be likely going forward increased monitoring and then corrective action and fines as well. In a less tangible sense, there's also just the reputation of the business. Organizations that fail to prioritize accessibility may be viewed as neglecting the needs of individuals with disabilities. And so obviously that can lead to negative perceptions and a loss of customer trust. It's just a bad look. And aside from being sort of exclusive or inconsiderate, I also think it just makes a business look sort of out of touch and old if it's not implementing these sort of standards for usability. So yeah, I think reputation is something that's hard to calculate, but it's definitely something that you want to consider when bringing your websites or products into compliance.
It's also interesting there too, because when you think about disabilities, a lot of times you're always thinking about like a permanent disability. So it's like you were born blind or you're deaf. Like those are just like not facts of life, but that's just something that people assume is going to always be there and it's not going to change tomorrow. But Angel, you and I are both wearing glasses, and it's like our vision can get progressively worse, and it's like we don't want to go to the eye doctor because we don't want to pay out of pocket. And
hey, I got
one
an
of the
eye doctor appointment later today, so
one of those things
I'm
on
serious.
there. Yeah, I mean, but that's like the funny thing, because it's like even my glasses, it's like they went out and I'm like, I don't want to go yet. You like look at it and it's like on a website, you can just hit Command plus and
Yeah,
it zooms
zoom
in.
in. Yeah.
And that's a facet of these rules where it's like you should be able to go on the website application and zoom in to the point where it's like, yeah, I forgot to like do my glasses today, or I forgot them at home, or I broke them. Like, you know, there's many things that can happen between now and tomorrow that makes it a very temporary system. But you don't want like your high worker to like not be able to do something. Like all of us have responsibilities that we have to do at work. And I think everyone would say it's worth the investment to make the technology accessible over saying, hey, I'm going to take PTO for a day or two until I can get my glasses, you know,
Right.
because you're not sick. Like I'd rather be in a nice warm beach to take my PTO and not because I don't have my glasses. So I think that's like another way to think of it as well, is it's like those temporary things as well.
Yeah, not just temporary. I mean, some of these disabilities are a result of aging. I mean, it's not necessarily going to get better. So there is injury, but there's also aging. And so I think that there's the potential there to really overlook or underestimate how many
Mhm.
people might need these accommodations. And maybe like you might need them one day. Probably everyone will need some kind of accommodation. And I mean, for example, color blindness, that is
Yes.
incredibly pervasive. So many people who are colorblind don't need accommodations elsewhere, really. So it might
Mhm.
not be something they're thinking of or you're thinking of, but that can really prevent them from using certain content or accessing certain things. And same with the eyesight, like Anwar was talking about. You were talking about increasing the text size. It's funny, I have seen instances where a website provides that option and you
Mhm.
use it, and then all of this content is pushed off the screen because they didn't think about it or how it would
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
look if you increase it to a certain size. And so
Like you add the button, but you don't like actually like try it out yourself.
yeah.
Right.
And then all of this information is inaccessible. And same thing with like screen readers. Something I've seen is people who use screen readers need to use their keyboards with like tab or enter
Mhm.
to access content. And if they navigate to a drop down, for instance, and they press enter and it doesn't drop down, then their screen reader can't read them those options. They can't go to any of those pages. And that's something that we've found in some of our work is that the tabbing and the navigation that isn't typical just doesn't work, and then it's completely unusable.
It's like interesting too, because you like think of like even not just like a disability, but like let's say like a mom or a dad who's like their kids watching Bluey in the background, and you don't want to like put on like a Senate hearing or something that you want to like listen to like what's this law that's changing, and it's like that's where subtitles come in, right? You don't have to just be deaf or be hard of hearing in this instance. You could legitimately just have a kid that wants to watch TV, and if you play a Senate hearing at the same time as them, they're going to be annoyed at you. So that's kind of like the ways to think of it, where it's like there's all of these legal ramifications and everything else that you have to think of, but then think of the convenience factor too, because I mean, just having subtitles, like a lot of people just like being able to read, you know, their
Yeah.
content
Yeah.
every day versus having to like listen to it because they have other stuff going on or their speakers aren't good, their speakers are broken. Like there can be so many things that lead up to this point where it's like, I don't actually need this every day, but today I do.
Mhm.
Yes, that stuff is very situational,
Yeah.
especially like the
Yeah.
captions piece. I know, like, let's say you're like commuting on a bus and you're trying to watch a video, but it's too loud. And that's where like captions would really benefit you. Like, it doesn't just benefit someone who's deaf or with like a disability like that, but like, an
Yeah.
everyday person, we could benefit from all this.
Yeah, speaking of captions, there was a lawsuit in 2012 against Netflix by the National Association for the Deaf, claiming that they violated ADA by not having those captions. So obviously in the settlement, Netflix had to caption 100% of its streaming content by 2014. And as you see now in all of these different streaming apps that we have, that's all
Mhm.
very standard. So that was a landmark case for that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when it comes to captions, I can say that I actually learn English from Spanish-speaking country. I learn English by actually reading captions and listening to the dialogue. So that was one way where captions might not have been intended for that, but that's how I actually learn to speak English and to listen to it and to read it. But to go back to something that Emma was talking about, in a time today where we're leaving, where basically experiences are number one, right? If you visit a website and you don't feel like that experience while you're either using your mouse or using your phone, that experience with the website, it can trigger, it can change in a heartbeat, whether you like that website or not, or whether you're actually going to use that business or not. All of that matters. And to Emma's point earlier about how some web pages do include that zoom in button. I've been actually on the receiving end of that, when you hit that zoom in button and half of the web page just goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And so you lose that content. So there's no thought to what's going to happen when you click that button. Is it going to rearrange everything for the person who's viewing it, for it to now display the content in a different manner so that they can take advantage of that? Or is it just going to do what we were talking about, which is just completely disappear off the page, and then you have to go somewhere else to find that extra content. So let's talk about experience and how this accessibility standards improve that experience for employees and customers with disabilities.
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to think about how much is digital now, especially with more and more people working from home. I mean, just think about your work day and how many websites and applications that you interact with every day. And if one or two or all of those aren't accessible to you as an employee with disabilities, I mean, you can't do your job at all. So
Right.
obviously, when those things are considered, it increases participation and retention for employees with disabilities, as well as just increasing productivity and morale, and also promotion rates. I mean, there are, of course, so many people out there with different passions and skill sets. And imagine if you are unable to pursue those things and really flourish in your career, even if you might be the best person for a job, you're unable to do it because of something so, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, arbitrary. Obviously, when these standards are implemented, people with disabilities have a more positive experience at work, and that fosters a better work environment for everyone. And then when it comes to customers with disabilities, if you're selling a digital product, it just needs to be usable by everyone. I mean, I think that's straightforward, and you're cutting down your potential customers by not catering to them. And as we discussed earlier, with temporary disabilities or age or injury, it's so easy to underestimate how many individuals may need accommodation. So you're in turn underestimating the amount of potential customers that are considering your product's accessibility. Just a little aside, I don't remember why, but I was using the IRS website. I don't remember why, but I do remember that I had a lot of trouble finding what I was looking for. And I just thought to myself, like, if I'm struggling and I work in tech, I mean, how many other people must be struggling and struggling more? We want federal agencies' benefits, welfare to be accessible to the people who need it most. But it seems like sometimes the people who need it most are the people who are prevented from accessing it because they're not considered.
You know, you add to that point of like just how much we use technology. It's like our time cards now are digital, right? Like a lot of the times, just you being able to say, I can do 99% of the rest of my job except for like punching my time on the computer. And, you know, even that's just like absurd. Like you want to be able to do all facets of your job, like if it's anything like from mailroom to the top level, but there's just that simple aspect of it's easier to track time through a computer because you can put in those fraction of an hour. You're not using a physical time card. You're not keeping up with that machine. So it's just like a laptop maybe that everyone's using. So even just thinking of it that way just makes it more important just to think of every other facet as well.
Yeah, we use applications and technology to communicate with our coworkers. So if you're not able to use these things, I mean, you're not only feeling very discriminated against, which is an awful feeling, but you're also being excluded from the work environment and from being able to be as productive as your coworkers and being able to connect with them and work with them. And I think that's a shame.
I was going to say, I don't know what's worse, either being actively discriminated against or not being considered at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hard part about a lot of this is it's just like we just talked about like all of these circumstances where it's like it makes it more real for you that you can consider like those scenarios of like glasses or closed captionings and stuff. But it's like, I mean, outright, like people who are blind or who have severe color blindness,
Right.
sometimes like you put an orange and white text or yellow text on white, and then it's like it disappears. So it's like you can't even see that button or that item or yellow warning. You can't see that warning in that instance. So it's like, what are you supposed to do in that instance that someone's trying to display like a digital warning of like, let's say a time tracker, and you're like saying, hey, time tracker's down, and you put in a yellow and white font and someone can't read that. So, you know, they log their hours, but then it didn't actually go through
lose it,
because the
yeah.
system was down.
Right.
So that's why you always have to consider all of those facets because it's like that was just a colorblind person in that instance and not just a colorblind person. But I'm saying like there are limitations not as like they can't see the screen. at all. It's just like you didn't consider one facet of that, umbrella.
And speaking of colors like that, we really do rely on colors like red for bad, green for good,
Mhm.
yellow or orange for warning to convey meaning. So if you don't provide an alternative explaining what it means to people who might not be able to see those colors, then I mean, that's useless. And same goes for icons, where it's very tempting to make things look as simple as possible by replacing buttons with an icon. But if you're not able to see or tell what that means, then it's useless. You don't want to just convey meaning in one way and not another, because that meaning might not mean anything to the person who's viewing it.
Also with the color
Right, Sandy.
piece, I feel like that's also something that might be different cultural too. I mean, same thing with the colors too. Green might be like pausing for us, but some another culture might not associate that as positive. Then same thing with red too. Like it might be negative for us, but could be a positive thing for another culture.
Speaking of culturally, is also just people with English as a second language. A lot of times translations are offered, but not in every language. So using simple language as well is really helpful for people who might have a limited vocabulary for one reason or another. It could be an education thing, it could be a language thing.
I mean, and also just like translation wise, direct translations don't always work because
True.
it's like the
Yes.
phrasing and like the word order is like so different
Yep.
regionally that it's like, I mean, you think of like soda versus pop, like even in like the United States, and it's like, well, I mean, if you translate pop to Spanish and they don't understand that pop is like a soda because you're just using Google Translate, then it's like you might get yourself into trouble.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of like the things that you're kind of considering when you're thinking of like that simplicity of language
Yeah.
when you're doing those translations. You're thinking of those icons, and like a lot of past design was always like skeuomorphism. So I'm just going to change this item to look directly like it was in a digital format. And recently the trend has been kind of going back more towards that. But at one point it got very abstract where it's just like some kind of shape and you should be able to figure out what this is. And a lot of people struggled with that where it's like, okay, I'm used to this like operating system, so I know where it's at, but how do I onboard someone who's new to it? So people are finding out that it's like sticking to those patterns that people are used to, like floppy disks and stuff like that, have a reason because you've trained so many people, even though they don't know what a floppy disk is, they know that that icon means
Icons.
save.
Yeah. And my next question was actually geared towards some of the things that you guys have been talking about, which is steps that can be taken to update policies and technologies to stay compliant. I think we've talked a little bit about that, but what else can you guys say about that?
So a lot of like what we've talked about, like where we look at like the Ally Project, where that's a really good website for any non-technical person just to go in and like say, oh, is keyboard navigation accessible? And they'll talk you through like hitting tab, reaching out to local organizations. So, you might know some local organization who have people with any kind of disability, even if it's like a retirement home, for example, who might have people who are just bad with technology. That might help you just understand how people navigate through this, understand some of those limitations that they might hit. It might not necessarily go through like going through a screen reader, but it does help you to understand like where are people struggling with my site, who might have limited vision or some of these other things. And I mean, also like self plug here, reaching out to us and us doing like an audit for them and going through their site and basically like saying, here's your problem areas. And especially like as an early step, like we did talk about it being more expensive if you don't know what you're doing. But to Emma's point as well, like if you're looking at April and then only starting an audit, you're going to be panicking a bit to try to do it as quickly as possible. And if you reach out to us now and you're like, hey, we need to get this done by then, you have more time to fix it because we're kind of in that gray area where it's like if your site's very non-compliant, it's kind of hitting the area where it's like you might have to pay for a lot of development time to get all this stuff done. So it's like the sooner you do it, the better. But also just the more yourself is understanding like what these limitations and rulings are and what that means and able to like advocate for it across your organization will just help you out as we get closer because if you know what the Ally Project is, you've read section 508, you're just able to spot stuff and point people to like those resources that will help you out as well. So yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of get compliant and stay compliant from my perspective.
You mentioned testing. I think that As we mentioned before, there's so many resources about like step-by-step roadmap or playbook or whatever you want to call it. Lots of websites that might scan things for you, but I would emphasize testing as the best way to make sure things are compliant. As we were talking about before with that text size thing, you might implement something like a text size adjustment and it might not work if you're not thorough enough in testing things out.
Yeah, I guess with the testing piece, I don't think you should necessarily rely on just automated testing or just manual. I think doing a combination of the two is good to make sure you kind of don't miss anything. Because I know with automated testing, sometimes there are some issues with color contrast on different kind of button states. Like when you're hovering over, it might miss that. So then that's where the manual assessment comes in to catch some of those little things that are looked over.
It's always like interesting how bad a site can be because you like look at it and you're like, someone might put a very important text in an image and then that's not screen reader compliant, but then you do an automated test. So just imagine like a computer looking at it and like saying, what is this? So it's not going to use any kind of technology to see what's actually in that image. All it's going to say is there's an image there and it might not have a description of what that image is. But if that image is, if you say that image is an image in that alt text, the screen reader will never know that that was actually supposed to be conveying a very important piece of information to someone. So it's like the screen reader might miss it because it's an image and it's just saying it's an image. And then it's like if you have color blindness, then you'll reach the point where it's like, oh, that image is also not color compliant and they can't even see what was supposed to be there. So it's like you could hit two things that a automated test might miss just because of how bad it is and what it's actually looking for, because it's more so looking at that code area, not what someone's actually seeing.
That reminds me, speaking of alt text and screen readers being able to interpret information, something I found is that accessibility actually helps with SEO because it helps search engine algorithms understand the content better and then improve searchability. So features like alt text for images, descriptive headings, clear link text help search engines accurately interpret website content. So that improves indexing and ranking. Also, accessibility practices involve using semantic HTML, proper heading structures, clear navigation. So all of those things are beneficial for search engine crawling and indexing. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
All right, so before we go, can you share examples of businesses that have successfully implemented these accessibility standards and what lessons might they have learned?
So I actually worked on a state project that was able to successfully implement these standards. What we were basically doing is having accessibility checks throughout the whole development lifecycle to make sure that any new features that we do implement are compliant. So just as the UX designer, what I do when I'm designing new features is that I make sure certain items like the color is compliant. So I guess the next step would be after my designs are complete, it moves on to the developers, and our front-end developers are well-versed in the accessibility standards. So they're kind of incorporating some of this as they're coding and building out our new features. So one thing they might do is ensure that the new feature can be navigated by users using a keyboard. So after this step, it moves on to our testers, and our QA team will do some manual checks on our new feature to make sure it's compliant to the standards. But we also have automated testing as well, which gives us a generated report of any accessibility issues that they have ran into. So we're also using a mix of manual and automated for this. So just to sum it up, just throughout the project lifecycle, all members of the team are knowledgeable in accessibility. So we're able to implement these standards in each of the various tasks that we do.
Alongside that, like, I mean, Moser, like our UX group, app dev group, like we've really tried to like use different launching points from some of the projects that we've worked on to really just understand like, is stuff accessible? Like some of the projects that we've worked on before have gotten into some legal trouble before we got involved. And so far, like a lot of our projects have done really well. We've been able to test with like a lot of users and really just make sure that we're not running into any trouble kind of moving forward. So that's really what we try to do, is just make sure that that's a heart of our group, is just understanding users, making more people advocates, because the more people that you have that advocate for it, not just at Moser, but also just like worldwide, the better it will be, because you have just another person that's like, oh, that's, you know, bad, or there's something wrong here, let's fix that. That allows another person to find benefits or access the local parks and stuff like that.
All right. And with that, we'd like to thank our team of Anwar Eaton, Sandy Nguyen, and Emma Rosen. And if you have any questions about this process and how Moser can help you, please don't hesitate to contact our website, moserit.com, where you'll find the application development team, which is where these guys work. And they can certainly help you out in making sure that you are up to the standards of the 508, up to ADA standards with your websites and your applications. So folks, thank you very much for joining us again on Ask Anything. We certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening in to this week's edition of Ask Anything presented by Moser Consulting. We hope you enjoyed listening to Anwar, Sandy, and Emma talk to us about the revised ADA/508 standards. Be sure to join us next time as we dive even deeper with our resident experts and what they're currently working on. Don't forget to share your ideas or topics with us on social media. In the meantime, please remember to give us a rating and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, so long, everybody.
Go.